your health. And how do we calculate if you're obese or overweight? Well, the most common way is using something called your BMI, your body mass index. And generally, it is your weight in kilograms divided by the square of your height in meters. And once we have that number, we plot you on a graph, something like this. And depending on where you are, you can either be in the gray zone, which is underweight, the green zone, which is a healthy weight, overweight, and obese. Some graphs tend to class and categorize the obese section into class 1 to severe and morbidly obese, but for the purposes of today, that'll be perfect. Granted, the system is a bit flawed. And if you are a bodybuilder with lots of muscle, you are heavy, you're not fat, but the scale still classifies you as obese. So it's more of a guideline at the moment. There are far more high-tech and sexy ways of doing it. We can do 3D body scans. We can do hydrostatic weighing, which is where we basically weigh you outside of water, weigh you inside water, and then do a whole lot of mathematical equations. Some really sexy stuff. The problem is these are often exceptionally costly. Very few facilities are able to provide those services, and many of them, like when you're exposed to biological impedance, you're exposed to a minor electroshock treatment, which has to be done under medical supervision. Right? So BMI is the best way forward. Okay. Is it as bad as people say it is? Pretty much. According to the World Health Organization, currently there are 2.3 billion individuals who are overweight or obese. That is greater than the total world population of 1927. That means in 90 years, the entire population has become obese. That is terrible. According to an article in the Lancet in 2014, in the past 3 decades, not a single country throughout the globe has managed to reduce its obesity rates. We are facing a crisis. And internationally in 2014, 39% of adults, that's 18 years and older, were overweight, with 13% of whom were classified as obese, while 31 million children under the age of 5 are obese. That's a crisis. However, many people view the current obesity epidemic as a contemporary phenomenon, blaming it on easy access to highly processed, palatable foods, excessive work routines, poor home lives, economic advantages of quick and easy mass-produced meals. However, obesity is not something new, and weight excess has come in and out of vogue several times throughout history. Right? From the birth of agrarian society through the Renaissance until the late 1800s, early 1900s, weight excess was often seen as beautiful, as a marker of status, prosperity, and wealth. As a marker of your socioeconomic status, it showed you had successful harvests, you had money to eat, you had leisure time. Importantly, you had the ability to lounge and dine indoors without spending a day in the field working. Right? And then in about late 1800s, early 1900s, we start to see a shift. And perceptions of beauty and body standards begin to change. And being pleasantly plump, as they called it, was no longer the best thing to be. Through various advances in medical technology, influences of the Great Depression, World War I, World War II, numerous women's rights movements, and the emergence of easily accessible grade A recreational drugs, which suppressed your appetite, became key influences toward a new body size and composition ideal. Furthermore, the concept of leisure time became associated with a more outdoorsy, sun-kissed kind of lifestyle, rather than that of being indoors reading. And as you can see here, body silhouettes began to change. It was no longer about being plump or robust. It was about, at certain times, about having that perfect hourglass figure that cinched your waist, giving you voluptuous hips and breasts. At other times, in the 1920s, women would strap down their breasts, giving themselves a almost washboard, androgynous type look that suited the flapper dresses of the 1920s. Right? And we've seen these several times since the early 1900s. Also, around this time, around the early 1920s, we start to see the emergence of cookbooks that are, yes, probably first started with wartime rations, but try to do a kind of optimal foraging, how to give you the maximum amount of nutrients using the least amount of food in the quickest amount of time, right? And so we see emergence of cookbooks that use coupons, ration books, etc. Granted, the types of foods that were available during war era weren't very healthy, and so often what we find is there's lots of processed meat, lots of condensed milk in almost everything. So even though they're trying to be healthy, they're trying to be low calorie, the facts are a little bit confusing. But the seed was nonetheless planted, and in the years since then, we have continued to witness the bloom of the low weight ideal, right? And by about 1980, we see the rise and the superstardom of the athletic supermodel, right? We have Farrah Fawcett, Cindy Crawford, Claudia Schiffer, and Naomi Campbell, the kind of icons of the athletic model ideal. Sorry, everyone. Right. Unfortunately, in about 1980, something also goes horribly wrong, and we see two major splits in the movement. We see the emergence of an extreme thin ideal, what became known, or popularly known, as heroin chic, right? It was this idolization of individuals who were gaunt, who look emaciated, those sunken cheekbones, famously made popular by Kate Moss in her Champagne Supernova partnership with Calvin Klein. And since then, that has been an exceptionally unhealthy and unattractive ideal that many women have tried to compete with. And in so doing, we have fostered, one, plastic surgery safaris, and two, eating disorders like bulimia and anorexia. Right? And where we fit in, obesity has skyrocketed. Since the 1980s, obesity rates have more than doubled. Right? There's a huge percentage of the population that are classified as overweight and obese. Shockingly, despite obesity being classified and recognized internationally as a medical condition, it is still highly stigmatized. It is no longer seen as a marker of beauty or prosperity, but is increasingly associated with being unhealthy, with the inability to restrain oneself, gluttony, being lazy, and generally unclean. Even medical practitioners who are highly educated and understand the complex social, environmental, and medical background that goes into obesity have been recorded as refusing to touch or assist with overweight patients or exhibiting inappropriate behavior towards them. This creates a kind of negative feedback loop where patients who ordinarily would have access to fantastic medical care and medical facilities no longer want to go to the doctor. They become ashamed, and so they stay at home and suffer in silence, making their suffering even worse and causing even further problems: hypertension, cardiac problems, diabetes. And quite frankly, with tens of millions of people dying of obesity-related illnesses, it is not very difficult to put a portion of the blame on their doorstep. Right. The point I hope you're trying to see is that obesity does not exist in a silo, except there are hundreds of different factors that push and pull and antagonize obesity. And just to name a few that are from the sociological aspects, right? Education, gender, historical context, socioeconomics, and urbanization, right? Those are some of the big ones that we'll discuss today. How does that affect us here in the South African context? Well, let's take a look. Starting off with urbanization, people who live in urban, peri-urban, and rural environments have varying degrees of access to healthcare and medical facilities, right? Outbreaks in rural areas are generally left unchecked, particularly by government, under apartheid and in the early years of democracy. Here, particularly the early years of HIV denialism come into play, as we'll see later on. Here in the urban environment, overnutrition and habitual eating in urban areas has led to the rise of non-communicable diseases. For those of you who don't know what non-communicable diseases are, those are ones that can't be non-infectious, they can't be transmitted. They're ones that you get through your environment, your lifestyle. So things like cancers, stroke, Alzheimer's, cataracts, osteoporosis. And then with the migration from rural and peri-urban environments into the urban centers, we have what's called the nutrition transition, right? Which is that people who are now in urban environments can access and eat larger, calorie-dense, highly processed, palatable foods on a far more regular basis than they could in the rural environment. Therefore, we see an increase in obesity prevalence in urban areas compared to rural areas. Gender, my favorite subject. South Africa has a deeply patriarchal society, and unfortunately, when children are born, the male child, the boy, will always be given preferential treatment, and this seems to be taken across the board from the most conservative Afrikaner family to traditional African families living in townships. The problem here is that the male child has both social and socioeconomic value, and so when we hit times of strife and hardship and there is not much food going around, the male child either gets the first cut, the prime meat, or will get the only meal, and the daughter is left without. Right? And what we're seeing is that malnutrition at critical childhood development stages seems to be associated with the prevalence towards obesity in childhood, particularly for women. We're not seeing the same thing for men. Right? Due to South Africa's history of migrant labor, and particularly with the unchecked diseases that were rife during apartheid and afterwards, we've seen that there is an entire generation gap where fathers and husbands have died or have gone off to work. And so approximately 50% of all households in South Africa are single-parent, female-headed households. Unfortunately, those households are also some of the poorest in the country, which means that 20% or over 20% of all those households say that they go hungry on a regular basis, either intentionally skipping meals to make their rations last or simply running out of money. Unfortunately, on a bit of a side note, I could not find a single study that looks at child-headed households. I think there's going to be some really interesting work coming out of that field sometime soon. Right? And in conclusion, there's an obesity prevalence is greater in women than in men. Right? Socioeconomics, a bit of a complex area where apartheid's race-based framework seems to have morphed into a kind of socioeconomic structure, with social inequalities being seen for education, healthcare access, housing and service delivery, job opportunities and earning potential, and geographic dislocation. What I mean by the last one is, even if you live in Cape Town, where you live in Cape Town can often determine how you experience the city. And we still have a very much a apartheid-era buffer zone kind of mentality where privileged white individuals live in the CBD or in special areas close to the sea, close to the mountain. And the further you get from the symbolic center into the Cape Flats, for example, there's a demographic change. There are buffer zones between. There are no trains that go out that way, or trains stop at a certain time of night, which means that you are cut off from the city because of where you live. Right? And this is particularly evident when we look at the annual consumption expenditure reports, the key one being the South African Living Conditions and Household Survey, which basically shows that when you divide up the national populace into 5 divisions, right, the lowest quintile, right, those who spend the least amount of money on consumption, food and other products, 25% of black households versus 0.7 white households. The highest quintile, those who spend the most and consume the most, 81% white households versus 8.2 black households. There's a significant difference in our Gini coefficient, right? What complicates our scenario here is that many traditional South African communities view excess as a sign of health and affluence and believe that it assists in childbearing, right? And that is across the board, rural and urban. And this impacts the relationship between socioeconomics and obesity. Right? Education, quite frankly, we're not entirely sure how education plays into this. Different studies report different things. Some say that there is a positive correlation between education level and obesity. The more you know, the more you grow, basically. Other studies say that there's a non-linear correlation. If you have no education, or if you have a tertiary education, your BMI will be lower than some women who have some education. In conclusion, we actually have no clue how education plays in. It's not conclusive. right? And then historical context. To begin with, yes, there are some very obvious ones here. If there is war, there are rations. If there's an economic disaster like a drought, fire, flood, if there is soil erosion, it impacts crops and availability of food. Political allegiances will lead to trade agreements, which means that we'll have more products, different food coming in. We're able to create different things. We can bake, we can cook with spices, we can do whatever that makes food more palatable food, more likely to be eaten, right? Cultural boycotts, certain, like McDonald's will say, right, we don't want to be in your country because of whatever reason. Strategic geographical locations, specifically here in the Cape, where the Dutch East India Company used us as a midway between Europe and the East. We got tons of crops, we got spices, we got all sorts that made our kind of culinary palette a lot more diverse than many other cities, right? And then cultural traditions and institutions. Here I'm particularly thinking about things that we do on a regular basis. Things that, yes, might be like the British have high tea or the Swedes have fika, where every week the family gets together and you all sit and have your scones or your cardamom buns and we lather them with cream and all sorts. There can also be something rather innocuous, right? Here in South Africa we have Wacky Wednesday, and every Wednesday families march off to Steers to get their 2-for-1 burger, and right. And that kind of environment, that kind of historical context leads itself to a certain kind of dietary habit, right? It's easier for us to go to McDonald's, to Wacky Wednesday, to whatever, 2-for-1 burger special at Spur on a Monday, because it's far cheaper. My kids get to run rides in the play area. I get time to myself. So that's the kind of environment we're living in. However, I now want to take a little bit of a left turn, and I want to look at food as a kind of mechanism for cultural memory, particularly in South Africa, in post-conflict and post-colonial societies, where not all versions of history have been properly recorded or objectively recorded. We can look to alternative forms of narrative to explore what actually happened and how did people really feel about it. And here are two fantastic examples of cookbooks that have been published recently, this one just last year, that explore the kind of relationship between food and memory, food and heritage, and how can we use food and the act of cooking to teach about District 6, to teach about Cape Malay culture. How can we use individual narratives and talk about, whatever while we're cooking, and teach about apartheid stories and violence and whatever. And that's kind of environment that children are being brought up in, right? I want to look at one year, 1936, right? Jesse Owens runs riots around the Germans at the Olympics. King Edward VIII abdicates. It's the year of 3 kings. So much happens globally. In South Africa, I want to look at one particular event that has left its lasting mark on our culinary landscape, right? And that's in terms of voting. Now, in 1930, then Prime Minister Hertzog signed into power the Women's Enfranchisement Act, which allowed all white women over the age of 21 to be allowed to vote. Fantastic. He also said in his speech that he would take active steps in the coming years to enfranchise all women of colour, allowing them to be symbolically incorporated into the national voting body. Fantastic. In celebration, oral history says that members of the Cape Malay community got together and made a Hertzoggie, right? A delicate little tart with half jam, half coconut, sometimes with meringue. It's a more contemporary thing. It is symbolic of the half white, half sweet jam. It is a delicate thing that represents fair opportunity, equality. It is a softer future for us all, right? However, in 1936, when the next amendment was made to the Voting Act, Hertzog signed into power the Representation of Natives Act, which basically, in the Cape Province, removed all non-white voters from the common voters' ballot, forcing them to vote for 3 native representative members who could sit at the House of Assembly, while the rest of the country had 4 senators voted for them by local government and traditional leaders, therefore ensuring there was no opposition to the apartheid government, no opposition to white rule. And so, as a major stuff for you to Hertzog, the community made what was called a tweeëge, a two-faced, the Janus, right? It is a hard coconut biscuit covered in pink and brown icing. Life was no longer a soft, delicate tart able to be eaten by children and the elderly. It was not a sweet and humble future of equality, of the unity of a white coconut, white meringue, and the bright and vibrant non-white culture. Instead, life became a hard biscuit. In this way, we eat not just to nourish. We eat to commemorate. We eat to fight against forgetting. We cook for the same reasons. We no longer simply eat to nourish. And in that way, food has become quite fashionable. And I don't mean that in the Lady Gaga meat dress kind of way, because that's just a little weird. What I mean is, food has become a quintessential fashion accessory. Whether you are a pop star washing your hair with Pantene, what do? You consume. Whether you are a supermodel on the runways of Milan, what do? You consume. Right? There is a food and drink for every occasion. We have been taught that no outfit is complete, as is topped off with your venti, double cap, half-half, pumpkin spice chai latte, right? And it's not just that. When we're happy, we celebrate with champagne. When we're sad, Bridget Jones teaches us that your fridge should always be filled with Chardonnay and lots of ice cream. Lord knows that's my fridge at the moment. Now, I want to end off with one picture. This is a photograph of a 99-cent store in America taken by German photographer Andreas Gustav. It was taken in 1999, printed in 1991, and in 2007, it went on auction at Sotheby's in London, right? I've actually written this down. It's been digitally manipulated to reduce the perspective, flattening the image. The colors have been muted. The subtle repetition of these discrete little blocks of color is reminiscent of a kind of Georges Seurat, a kind of proto-pointless painting. And when it went on auction in February 2007 at Sotheby's, it was sold for a groundbreaking $3.34 million, making it at the time the most expensive photograph ever sold. It was also the first photograph in history to break the $3 million glass ceiling. Now, I believe if you ask me, it is a relatively unremarkable photograph. There is nothing special about it. And yet, I believe it is our connection with food and its application to all life's moments, and the supermarket as this magical realm with its powers of escapism and retail therapy, which things like Canal Walk have been known for, that helped make this such a prized photograph. Now, I seem to have ran through this. I want to leave you with a couple of questions, some homework for tomorrow. What does it mean to you when you see food? When you walk down the supermarket and you see those brightly colored cereal boxes and packets and whatever? How do you feel? What does your brain do? Do your palms start sweating? When you open up the menu and it's just text, do you become sad? When you open the menu and there's pictures of the juicy food, what happens to you? Do you salivate? And it's at this point that I want to leave you at the intersection of food and the realm of the visual. Please think about those questions, because tomorrow David will be picking up with the kind of biological aspects, the neuroscience of what happens when you actually see food, what goes on inside your body. Right. That is unfortunately my presentation. I've ran through this. Are there any questions? Yes.
You spoke about the studies.
Yes.
Single parents. You said there was a certain family grouping that you haven't seen.
Yes, a child-headed household. So what we're seeing in the wake of civil wars, particularly if you look at Rwanda, where entire mother and father have been wiped out, there is this huge rise of child-headed households where a 13-year-old or 14-year-old girl is now looking after herself, her brothers, her sisters, her nephew, whoever. And I've seen no studies coming out of those kinds of environments that looks at their kind of nutrition, their diets, their obesity prevalence, anything like that.
So please could you go back to the previous slide?
Sure. David will tell you all about something called a visual food cue reactivity when he looks at his EEG work. It's honestly, it's mind-blowing. Stay tuned. Any other questions? Really? Nothing? Was it that bad? Yes. Yes. Well, it's a 99-cent store.
I'm sure is the key, well, one of the many keys to the obesity thing.
Absolutely.
That's what our shopping centres or our supermarkets have become.
Absolutely. And if you are one of those single-parent, female-headed households, and all you're earning is 150 Rand for this week, a 99-cent store, that's going to be an absolute godsend. So yes, everything you see there is going to do me harm. It's going to do my kids harm, but they'll go to bed with a full stomach tonight. And I have to beg the question, if that is the mother's responsibility to either go out and buy some organic salad ingredients that are going to feed her kid tonight and that's it, or take them to McDonald's where they can get a really large meal for 14 Rand, we kind of step into this kind of ethical gray zone that we really need to think about. And the kind of problems that are with mass-produced, highly palatable, nutritionless food. Right? And how do we combat that? And I find it very interesting to think about the kind of organic food movement, right? If you go into the townships, people have been growing their own food in their veggie gardens behind their shacks for decades. And yet, those are organic. They didn't have money to spend on fertilizers and whatever, anti-bug spray. And yet, now if you go to Woolworths, everything you look at is organic and free range, and this you get. I remember once I went into Woolworths and got free range Brussels sprouts. What the hell is a free range Brussels sprout? You throw it in there, oh yes, you can be free wherever you want to. There's no such thing. And yet we seem to prize this, and we are willing to pay through our teeth because we think it's better for us, it's better for the environment, it's better for our kids. And it's a fad. When if you look at the townships, they've been doing that the whole time. And there are still nutrition problems, and there's a whole lot going on. It's not just about eating. There's a whole lot of problems.
There's also I can't remember what they called, the guidelines that America brought out around food, I think in the early 80s or 70s.
Yeah.
Where suddenly there was such an emphasis on grains.
So David will actually discuss, there was a huge battle between sugar and fat. There we go. And he will actually explore some of that tomorrow.
Okay, great. Don't you want to just come now, David?
No, we have the time. I've got your slides on my computer. Good to go. Yes? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Why do you think the obesity epidemic is parallel with the growing cultural idealization of a thin body type? And the second was you commented a lot on the female cultural influences, and I wondered if you could say something about the cultural influences of the male.
Look, there has been significantly less done on males, particularly because if you look at South Africa and globally, women are the most, or the demographic that is the most obese. I think in South Africa it's 63%. It's astronomical. So lots of time has been dedicated to that. To go back to your first question, why the parallel? I do think that I think there's a partly an antagonistic relationship of comfort eating. I'm never going to be Kate Moss anorexic. So I do think there's that part of it. David, I don't know if you have any ideas on this.
Yes, actually it's not strange idealizations of body shape are tied to their
I'll explain now. So for those of you who didn't hear, David said that there is a correlation between the kind of ideal body type and the inability to achieve it and a kind of reaction to that, which goes with the kind of healthy eating or unhealthy eating. Also, David pointed out that there's a feel-good index. I beg your pardon? Feel ideal index, which is basically they say to you, if I remember correctly, which is the one I saw, they show you a whole lot of pictures and say, right, what is your ideal body type, right? This one here. What is your body type? This one here. And you kind of mark off on these diagrams. A lot, not unlike something very similar to that, where you have a whole lot of silhouettes, and they say to you, right, what is the ideal body type? And you mark off one, and then they say to you, right, which is yours? Which one, where do you belong? And you go, right, I'm somewhere over here. All right, that's me over there. Great. And then they will actually do studies on you to determine your BMI, your body fat percentage, and they kind of say, well, look, there's a discrepancy between where you think you are and where you actually are. And you actually are possibly further down, higher to where you want it to be, to the ideal body type, or whatever. And I'm sure you've often seen that comic where there's the big bodybuilder standing in front of the mirror, rah, and he's muscles and ripped, but his reflection in the mirror is a little scrawny man. And it's that kind of discrepancy that psychologically you view that you are too thin, too fat, whatever. You are not, you don't view it, you view yourself as you actually are. Does that help answer your questions? Anybody else? Okie dokie, shall we go then? Thank you very much for coming. I hope you have a fantastic evening, and please drive safely. When you go home to your families and you are either going to Woolworths to buy food, you're going to go sit down with your families, or you're going out for dinner, think about the food around you. Pay attention to what you see. What do you see? How do you see it? And if you're viewing food that is not on your plate or around you, take note of that. Is it somebody else's food that you're paying attention to? Thank you very much, everyone. Drive safely. See you tomorrow. Thank you very much, Ryan. That was absolutely, I ran through that.
No, you just shouted off a bit shaky, but that's where you got into your groove.
I did, didn't I? I did, yeah. Anyway.
Cool. Thanks so much.